There we go.
All right. So my talk. Let me preface this. I don't actually know anything in a scholarly sense about maps. We should get that out of the way in the beginning. My background, I did a PhD in history, particularly in the politics of history. The way history is written, the way current events and contemporary political disputes shape the way we view the past. My interest in maps began honestly when I was at the archives trying to do research and got bored and kept finding maps in the archives that were much more interesting than what I was supposed to be working on. This also happened at a point in the time when I feel like the internet had kind of brought out everyone's inner map nerd. Places like the Atlantic would always be very excited about articles that had maps in them. You'd try to pitch them an idea and they'd be like, well, we're not really interested. And then you'd send them the same idea with a map attached to it and they'd be like, oh, that's really cool. People are going to love this map. Let's go ahead and publish it. Originally, the interest in maps was kind of a roundabout way to get people to pay attention to the history that I was more interested in, while also helping to distract me from the history that I wasn't interested in. Anyways, where this is all going is that the politics of map making, the politics of how maps are created, how maps are viewed, how maps are used in political discourse, I think has a lot of interesting comparisons with the way these same debates take place in history. And as I said in the description of the talk, I think there's a similar dilemma for people who are involved in making maps as for people who are involved in writing history, in that you're at once trying to be objective. You're relying on data, whether it's geographic data, whether it's statistical data, whether in the case of historians, it's stuff that you find in the archives. You're using this data to try to say something that's objective and accurate. And yet you're doing it in a time when where we now realize that all the decisions we make are going to be political, and the way we present the data we find is inevitably going to reflect some of our biases. And so the question really is, how do we weigh those two things? How do we try to be accurate? How do we try to recognize that the agendas that we have, while presenting, be it maps or historical research, and balance the fact that we're still all very much trying to be objective while recognizing at the same time we can't be. I don't have an answer to this question, but by way of providing some context, I thought I'd look back at some of the most interesting debates that have happened kind of publicly in the last decade or so about the politics of maps, and looking at how maps embody perspectives, and looking at some of the assumptions people make about how maps embody perspectives, in the way our own claims about the biases in maps sometimes reveal our own biases, or sometimes blind us to some of the complexity that is involved in the way maps represent the world. Again, doesn't answer the question of how we balance objectivity and bias, but I hopefully, at least, and I found this has helped in some of my work, make all of us aware of the complexity, the trade-offs, and how we can begin to negotiate them. So with that said, begin by saying I'd say in the 70s or so, people realized that maps were political. And I don't know, people probably realized this beforehand, but we imagine there was a kind of era in the 40s and 50s. People really believed in science. People thought science was objective. People thought science was accurate. There was this kind of unquestioned positivism where in the United States and in the rest of the world, the hope was that, again, science could solve our problems relying on data, objectivity. Numbers would give us an accurate understanding of the world. It would enable us to solve social problems as easily as we had solved technological problems. In that this would be, particularly in the social sciences, I think in the 60s and 70s, there was an increasing interest in whether statistics or a kind of scientific approach could be brought to could be brought to dealing with human relations in the way that it had worked for the material world. And this, for a lot of social welfare programs, for example, things like the Peace Corps, US aid programs for the third world, were all based on this idea that we could understand human societies mathematically and use that knowledge to improve government, improve human interaction. And it turned out not to work that well. So at the same time, people were trying to apply these lessons from science to the humanities. I think there was gradually recognition that actually even in science, this didn't work as well as we had hoped. And so certain things like, nuclear power, there was a growing awareness of things like radiation, which somehow people were like, I guess nuclear power didn't work out as well as we thought it was going to. And some of the skepticism that people began to have about the use of objectivity and perfectibility in science belatedly spread over, where people hoped they could make the humanities replicate the perfection and objectivity of science. In the 60s and 70s, there came to be a realization that even science wasn't as objective as people had hoped. This is a roundabout way of getting to the fact that maps were one of the first targets of this new awareness. And in the 70s, there was an increasing interest in the fact that maps were not just inherently political, but that under the claim of objectivity, under the claim of perfectly representing the world, maps were actually very good at representing the perspectives of the people who were making them. And so this book on the left, Mark Montminor, I've read his book, I still have no idea how his name is pronounced, wrote one of the first big works on this, and then people picked up on it. And now I'd say within the last, 5 or 10 years, in part because of the fact that everyone on the internet loves maps, there's been this profusion of interest in the fact that all maps lie. And you've seen, particularly critiques of the Mercator projection and how that distorts the world, articles with titles like "Every Map You've Ever Seen of Africa is Wrong." These have become very popular, almost clickbait style parts of the internet map landscape. And so the premise, or I guess the first place to begin with all this is that, this was a good point. It's good that people figured out that maps were political. In that, if people hadn't realized that or hadn't thought about that before, it was an important thing for them to start thinking about. But the premise of my talk, starting from that, is that once people figured out that maps were political, no one quite knew where to go with it. And one of the best example, and I think it comes from this Mark Montminor book, is that he took a map of a Caribbean island that showed all the beaches and casinos. And the point about the map was, well, it isn't interesting that this map of a Caribbean island made for tourists shows where the beaches and casinos are, not where the political prisons are in which the dictator who runs the island tortures his enemies. And that's a key point. Again, that sort of gets to the essence of the fact that, yes, this is, that is a political decision. And when you're looking at a tourist map, it is telling you certain things and not telling you other things that very much reflect the interests of the people who made it, namely to get you to go there as a tourist and spend money, and not the interests of, say, a human rights organization. But by the same token, pointing that out is important. It also strikes a lot of people as self-evident. You say, well, yeah, we knew there were bad things going on, but we were tourists and we wanted a tourist map, and we weren't going to visit the military prisons. We were going to the beaches and the casinos. So we wanted a map that showed us where we want to go. And if, back during the Cold War, Amnesty International would make maps of where all the prisons in the Soviet Union were located. And if your point is to make a political critique of a government, it's sort of self-evident to people that, yeah, then you want the map with the prisons, not the map of the nice beaches. As someone who's now read a lot of stuff about the politics of maps, and I don't know if other people here have, one of my frustrations is that that's the kind of the debate about maps being political never really advanced beyond that. People were very eager to critique the biases of maps they didn't like, but no one really knew where to go next. And when people tried to fix the biases of maps, I would argue they often stumbled into political errors, or they ended up with equally politicized maps that were simply trying to make a different point. And the example that I think most people are familiar with that we'll talk about is as the critique of the Mercator map became increasingly well known. In, I think, the late 70s to the early 80s, there was a fad for the Gall-Peters projection, which I assume people have seen. It was very much presented initially as, this is the real map of the world that your teachers haven't told you about. You've been lied to all your life by the Mercator projection, and, here we have the truth for you. And again, I think everyone in this audience probably knows much better than me, this wasn't necessarily a more accurate map as it was often presented. It was simply a very different approach to mapping the world from the Mercator projection, which emphasized territory, which emphasized maintaining the size of territories at the expense of getting the shapes wrong. And so this is now generated its backlash. This is from the XKCD, What Your Favorite Map Projection Says About You cartoon. There also, as the Gall-Peters became popular as a political statement, it generated a backlash from people who were saying, this isn't a better map, this isn't a more objective map, this is just a map that is offering a different, equally political perspective. And I think some people would say precisely because it looks so dramatically different from the map that we're used to, is almost more effective at presenting that image. Or it makes a more powerful political statement precisely because it is so different from the Mercator projection than another map projection, which might get you the best of both worlds and would actually get the size of the continents right without distorting the shape so much. You can wade into, there have now been entire books written about the Gall-Peters-Mercator debate, which, are kind of fun if you're into that sort of thing. But there's the sort of second order critique is that now people who have the Mercator haters have in fact created a myth in which, according to them, the Mercator map was the only map anyone had ever seen before 1980. Before this radical new map was proposed. When in fact, it turns out that even by the 1950s, most schools had moved away from the kind of very classic giant Greenland, giant Antarctica Mercator projection, and were offering their students much more sophisticated versions of the world. And I would also add, too, that no one 1950s geography teachers, it turns out, or 1950s geography textbooks, were more eager to explain to students how the Mercator map distorted the world than pretty much anyone else in the world. And my suspicion is a lot of students simply ignored the detailed explanations they got of this in class. It was not that they were lied to by their teachers, but that they ignored their teachers when their teachers tried to explain that, in fact, the image they were being shown was a skewed representation of reality. So I bring up the Gall-Peters-Mercator debate as simply one example, and we can talk more about this later, of how recognizing that the images that we're used to are politicized doesn't necessarily immediately answer the question of what the alternative should be, and sometimes leads us into a situation where the alternatives we try to suggest end up being as politicized as what we're used to. And we may, if you like those politics, then there still can be some benefit to that. It's not, the second part of that is that there are often good reasons to do things that are political. But that is, the goal of recognizing the maps are political is not to say, all right, here, now we found the perfect non-political alternative, but to think about how the alternatives that we might suggest are political and how we can use those politics effectively. The example of this how much time have we? I don't actually have the clock when I'm.
Yeah, so we lost roughly 10 minutes. So I'm going to say you got about a half hour left.
All right, I won't take all that time. let me talk about one of my favorite, and I think still mystifying to me, questions about the politics of maps, very much related to this Gall-Peters-Mercator debate, which is, why is North on the map up? And this is something that, well, many people presumably have never thought of. At the point where most people thought of it, or at least when I was first kind of made aware of it, I was told that it was a completely arbitrary decision. And then it was explained to me as being an explicitly political decision. And that the explanation people get of why North is up on the map is that people living in Northern Europe made the maps, they decided they wanted to be on top, and that was the end of the story. In this, and as much as for, I guess, decades, I never really thought about why North was up to begin with, once I thought about it and was given this explanation for it, then that was probably the last time I really thought about it for a decade. And yet there's also, I think, an interesting paradox here, in that on one hand, this version of North is up because Europeans made the maps is supposed to be a corrective to, or is supposed to remind us of this kind of European bias that we all bring to the world. It's supposed to remind us of how our view of the world is shaped by, living in the Northern Hemisphere, being part of an Anglo-American culture. In a way, it turns out, or it seems like, again, I've read a lot about this and still I'm not sure what the answer is. It seems like this story for why North is on top of the map also, in a weird way, replicates those same set of biases. And that when you say, well, North is on top of the map because Europeans made the maps and they wanted to be on top, it kind of takes for granted that the people who invented the map of the modern world were living in Northern Europe. And when you actually go through the history of how maps were created and try to figure out how North ended up on top of the map, it gets to be a much more complicated story. It turns out a lot of the people involved were very much not living in Northern Europe. And it also turns out, and if anyone knows more about this, I would be eager to hear about it. To the best of my knowledge, no one actually knows how and when we ended up with North as the definitive top of our maps. I'm going to pause here and say if anyone does know, I would be eager for them to jump in.
Nick, as an Australian, I just want to say that this is a deeply emotional and angering topic. And I also want to add that we had the so-called Jacaranda Atlas when I was a kid. The Peters projection came along, was a big deal. And the thing we realized was that our maps had the equator 2/3 of the way down the page. So Australia was, a third the size of Greenland, it's the other way around. It was just, and we're sitting in Australia. It was really a very strange British imposition. Yeah. Anyway.
And I was going to say, right, I think the Australians led the way in calling attention to this fact. And
then I remember the Mapmakers projection. Have you ever seen that?
Wait, no. Which one is
gigantic? Scotland is basically everything. Yeah, it's a very nice map.
That's funny.
Yeah, you should find that one, the Mapmakers projection. But yeah, and that did point to, it really helped point to the political nature of all of this. Yeah.
Well, and I was going to say, so right, when you try to get maps of the upside down world map on the internet, mostly what you find are tea towels sold in Australia and New Zealand with this map emblazoned on them.
Right.
Right. Dan is writing to ask, what effect rivers mostly running south has to do on this question, rivers running down the map.
I'm so glad that someone asked that. That was going to be... So literally, when I started reading about this, the first evidence that anyone can find for how maps, like the very earliest human maps were oriented, were made in Egypt, and they had south on top. And the assumption was, because the river that people knew about was the Nile, and the Nile runs from south to north, and people assumed it was flowing downhill or, flowing in the direction of gravity. And so that resulted in an apparently very early set of Egyptian maps that had that had south on top. The other way this came into play, apparently when the Chinese first invented the compass, they I guess they used spoons originally. And they also had south on top, because the assumption China's in the northern hemisphere, obviously, but the assumption was that the direction that the magnet, I mean, even I guess worth pointing out, compasses don't face north, which is something that also only realized much too late in this whole process. Compasses point both north and south, and you decide which side of the compass you think is pointing in the direction that you want it to be pointing. The Chinese originally referred to compasses as south-pointing stones, because again, the assumption was that whatever force was causing the compasses to go in one direction, they saw as being parallel to gravity. And so in the same sense that kind of rivers seem to have a direction to them that matched up with what people knew about gravity, the same assumption was applied to compasses. So two of the earliest data points that people have come up with about how maps were originally oriented. I get one example coming from Egypt, in which it was the flow of the Nile that put south on top. And the other example coming from China, when it was this idea that magnets and gravity must align, that led to south being on top. So the question is then, how does this get to the combination of, well, how do we get from this thousands of years ago to north being on top? And this is where things get really fuzzy. Here's the map, obviously. Right, so Ptolemy's map of the world, they knew it at the time. Ptolemy was a Greek mathematician, lived in Egypt in the 3rd century, did a map of the world. No one actually has any copies of the map, but they have Byzantine recreations of the map in which north was on top. And again, if you look at where Egypt is in this map, it's not actually clear that he's putting himself in Egypt on the top or the bottom of the world. It's not, if you were someone sitting in Egypt in the 3rd century and you were trying to create a map, there's no kind of obvious political bias or interest that would lead you, at least as far as I can tell, to put yourself, to orient this map one way or the other. Put you on the bottom half of things. And so it's not clear. So one version is that this is when north being on top started, and it was some random decision that Ptolemy made in the 3rd century that everyone just kind of stuck with. But that's a little hard to buy into, because then when you look at what happened over the next 2,000 years, all sorts of crazy things happened with the direction of maps. So if Ptolemy happened to do things in a way that line up with the way we do them now, it's not, from a kind of historical causation perspective, clear that that should have any impact on what happened afterwards. There was an entire Arabic Islamic map-making tradition which pretty consistently puts south on top. And again, this is something where no one actually knows why. It may be because they developed map-making techniques that they borrowed from the Chinese, and so they kept the Chinese orientation. There are a lot of different theories about where, and again, this is why none of this ever really makes much sense. You read theories like, well, for people in the Islamic world living in the Middle East, which you can see kind of in the center here, they wanted Mecca, which was a religiously significant point to them, to be on top. So they were actually intentionally orienting the maps in a way that put them on the bottom and put their religiously significant site on top. So even though they were orienting the map with south on top, they were actually doing it for a reason that reflected their own cultural prejudices, namely a desire to prioritize their Islamic religious site. So again, you can parse these arguments about what the politics of maps actually are in a lot of different ways. And you can retroactively try to read different kinds of biases in them that are often that can seem very esoteric, and where it's not actually, and again, you're doing this all without any evidence of why people made the decisions they did to begin with. So going into the era of modern map making, in the medieval period, 1100, 1200 AD, this is what the best maps in the world were made in the Middle East by usually Muslim map makers. This was the kind of default orientation of world maps. It's actually worth noting, in the Christian world, they had much less precise maps, but they also very clearly oriented them in a religious way. So the standard, these are medieval maps of the world, I think both from England. And what you see, if you can, especially the one on the left, you can kind of make out the brown thing in the center bottom is the Mediterranean Ocean. And so in the Middle East is kind of right in the center. And all these maps had east on top, which put England especially in the bottom. But the goal, again, these were made with a religious mindset, and you can actually see they all have Jesus on the very top of them. So as with the theory for Islamic map making, the goal for people wasn't necessarily to put themselves on top, but to put the things they associated with their religion, their religious priorities, on top of the map. It's also worth noting, no one was using these maps for travel, for navigation. I mean, you can see it would be hard to get somewhere using this map. So they were, in a sense, purely symbolic. This starts to change in the 13th century, when all of a sudden people finally start using maps for navigation. And you get these Portolan charts, which are made by a mix of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish map makers living in the Mediterranean. Some of them are living in Majorca off the Spanish coast. Some of them are living in Sicily. And for the first time, these are people making maps that are actually going to be used by sea captains to travel around the Mediterranean. And it coincides with the first period where people start using compasses, not as they were initially used in China as a kind of novelty, but as a way of finding direction. And so a couple things happen at this point. For the first time, you start seeing maps in which you have this kind of compass rose you see on the right side of the screen, sometimes very elaborate, dramatic compass roses. This was part of, they're actually, in these maps, there are a bunch of weird stylistic things. The compass rose was originally a stylistic thing. People would show off their map making techniques by making very fancy, elaborate compass roses. They'd also paint the Red Sea red. The mountain ranges would often be shown like giant chicken feet. This is not one of the better examples, but if you can see the Alps up above Italy there, in some cases this is sort of like a stylized chicken foot. In some cases, they really do look like giant chicken feet. And so these were both very decorative atlases, but very functional atlases. And what's interesting is for the first time, they started showing compass roses with north very clearly depicted in them. And you see in this, it's pointing north, there's a big kind of star, and some of them had suns up north. But the maps themselves it wasn't just they were oriented south or east. In a lot of cases, they didn't have an orientation at all. And so if you look at this, the way the tents drawn around the border of this map are shown, they're kind of all facing in. And the idea is that this map would sit on a table on a boat. And whichever way you looked at it, you'd kind of want the part you were looking at it from to be up. So if you were looking in the south facing north, the tents in Africa would be right side up. But if you were standing up in Scandinavia looking south at Europe, the little pictures, the flags, the tents would also be from your point of view facing up. So you get this weird combination where on one hand, people have recognized that north is a unique or important direction, but they're not orienting their maps accordingly. I guess the key point here too is also, so the Chinese had compasses, but they weren't using them for navigation. When people in the Northern Hemisphere started using maps as a navigation tool, when people in the Northern Hemisphere started using compasses as a navigation tool, they saw them as a replacement for the North Star. And so here's actually a moment where the fact that people making the maps were in the Northern Hemisphere did matter. People in the Northern Hemisphere, the one fixed point in the sky that they could use for navigation was the North Star. In the southern hemisphere, people would be navigating with the Southern Cross, which pointed south. But because they were in the northern hemisphere, and they were used to navigating with north as a fixed point because it was what they could determine by looking at the sky, when they got compasses, they saw the compasses as an artificial replacement for the North Star. Something they could use when it was too cloudy to give them the information they used to get from the North Star. And that's why I think it made sense that at this point, when they started using compasses, the assumption was that compasses pointed north. So here's what the politics of this get particularly mysterious. In that, like around 1400, you had people in the Mediterranean who weren't in Northern Europe, who when you kind of draw the map of the world are actually closer to being in the middle of it, who'd already determined north as the most important direction, but didn't necessarily turn that into a fixed standard for their map making. Now, it turns out it is when map making moves towards the further north, towards Germany and towards England, when you have people like, I think this is Waldseemüller's map of the world, Gerard Mercator, making maps in Northern Europe, in Germany and England, that does coincide with the standardized orientation of north being on top, but it comes at a moment where things already seem to be moving in that direction. You also, making it more confusing, the people making these maps rediscovered Ptolemy at this point. And so here, I think he's the guy on the left. I mean, they had no idea what he looked like, but they'd start including little pictures of Ptolemy in their maps because they saw him as the godfather of Western map making. And they drew a line between his early maps of the world, on which north was on top, and the maps that they were making. And this leaves us with the unsatisfying conclusion that no one really knows, again, to the extent that I've been able to figure out reading books about this, no one knows why the decision to put north on top actually happened. And it's, in a way, what I'm trying to suggest, as kind of convenient of a myth, as satisfying a political narrative, to say that north is on top because the Europeans wanted it that way, than to deal with the much messier way in which technology, history, European map making, non-European map making came together to give us a result that aligns with some of our biases, but doesn't necessarily, I would argue, or can't necessarily be explained by them. And it creates a situation where, again, for Australians to have a map that's flipped upside down makes perfect sense. For people in the Northern Hemisphere to do that as a political statement, I guess the fantasy is that we can then now correct all the problems with the world, all the biases, all the injustices between the global North and the global South with something as easy, with sort of such a grand symbolic gesture as flipping the map over. And you can both at once understand why this is a very satisfying and appealing idea. Where are we?
You're good. You're good.
Oh, I was getting some weird.
We got a hot mic.
Okay, but yeah, recognizing the complicated history also makes that solution seem more complicated than it might otherwise as well. So that's the essence of my what I have to say about this week. I so much more to talk about, but yeah, at this point, I'll ask if anyone else has any thoughts, questions, answers, what have you.
So many things. There's a few people who have questions in the chat. I'm going to let them speak. So maybe Julia, do you want to ask your question first?
It's actually a question from my partner who's listening to this also.
I'm glad it's such a family occasion here.
So he was wondering if part of the reason maps were drawn to focus on like the northern hemisphere, at least from Europeans, was because they believed the southern hemisphere was uninhabitable.
But yeah, I think that was wasn't that like a medieval doctrinal thing for a while from the church? This is the dregs of my memory.
So what's weird to me is that, see, now there are so many more maps that I wish I had pictures of. I mean, initially in a lot of the early, I mean, you can kind of see it, I suppose, in these maps. They didn't actually have a good sense of how much Southern Hemisphere and Northern Hemisphere and Eastern and Western Hemisphere that even existed. And I think in some cases, I mean, right, they didn't know that there were people living further south, but they also, I just think, didn't know that there was that much of both the Southern Hemisphere and of East Asia. And so it's interesting that for all the debates now are about who ended up on top of the map, the real fixation apparently for medieval map makers was what the center of the map was going to be. And that initially during the medieval period, the goal was to always have Jerusalem in the center. And what people wanted, the idea of Jerusalem in the center was balanced on this idea that the southern, I mean, this was the old world, so they sort of thought of it as three continents. Africa is the southern one, Asia is the eastern one, and Europe is the northern one. And the goal was that they thought all of these should be balanced geographically, and that Jerusalem belonged right in the center. And apparently, even before the discovery of the New World, even before the discovery that the Earth went around the sun, even before evolution, supposedly one of the big debates between science and religion that occurred in the medieval period was when they realized how far east Asia stretched. And all of a sudden, map makers were looking at the world and saying, we still know what's going on in the southern hemisphere, but clearly if you made this circle the correct dimensions, Jerusalem wouldn't be in the center anymore. This balanced worldview doesn't actually work. And then obviously when they discovered the New World, everything got completely thrown off. So that's my roundabout way of saying I don't actually know the answer to your question, but this is some other stuff that I do know.
That's good stuff.
Todd, you want to pop in with your question?
Hey, great talk. Thank you so much for doing this. I was curious about seems like there's a functional role with the orientation of the map, but maybe that's just I haven't thought enough about maps. So I was wondering would Muslim people, map makers, make maps so that the person holding it would be oriented toward Mecca, which is something important for praying, I think.
Right. I mean, so that's what's in that sense, the idea of Mecca being on the north as an explanation for why Muslim map makers made maps like this makes sense to me. And that, right, so much of the use of maps in the Muslim world was for figuring out which direction Mecca was in, that right, Mecca as the kind of area of priority fits, and that you would want to use your map to figure out where Mecca was. And I mean, you could do a decent job with a map like this one. I mean, you wouldn't, if you're in Italy, you could find out that Mecca was that way. And so, yeah, in that sense, it seems intuitive to me that there'd be a functional, or that the doing south up, which would put Mecca on top, would fit with the kind of the main function for which people were using maps a lot of the time. Although it's still kind of funny because it ends up in not just the cultural bias of where Mecca is and the decision to prioritize Mecca, but also it ends up making, people who were in Baghdad at the time, which I mean is the center of this map, it kind of corresponds with them being the center of the world, and then if you're a Muslim from East Asia, or if you're a Muslim from West Africa, and you wanted to put Mecca on top, you'd actually orient your maps in a completely different way. So it's funny to see, I guess actually the Middle East is another great example of this. Now people talk about how the Middle East, when you use that term, reflects a Western perspective. And that obviously the Middle East is only the Middle East if you're looking at it from England towards India, and that's facing east, and the Middle East is in the middle. And indeed, as people have pointed out, in India, they refer to the Middle East as West Asia. So this is a very cultural specific way of viewing the world, and this terminology does reflect the kind of viewer's position in Western Europe. But then it's funny, when you go back to some of the old medieval Islamic geographic terms, you see essentially the same conceptualization of the world. I'm getting really distracted by the goats on my screen. I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to shift to those in a minute. But you see like or Northern Africa now in Arabic is still referred to as the Maghreb, which means the West. And so even for medieval Islamic geographers, they were essentially doing the same thing that Europeans are doing when they call the Middle East, which is calling the places that were to the west of them the West.
Yeah.
Can we just go full screen to the goats now?
Absolutely. Any other questions from folks?
Yeah, I had a couple of things. If that's so, well, maybe I'll just make it one. So we've worked with cartograms for some of our work, and there's been a lot of development that we've seen, I suppose, in trying to make cartograms better to represent, information about countries or states. And there's a fantastic sort of history there as well. But one thing that struck me there at some point is, globes, right? Why don't we just show things on globes, and then, we're going to get away from a lot of these problems. And I was just sort of looking up the history of that, and I guess it's the 1500s from which we have globes that survive at least. So I just sort of wonder about the timeline of globe making and how, globe makers, I'm not even sure what to call them, versus cartographers.
Good question.
What's sort of the game there, I remember in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, this sort of line, like, do you think England is a conspiracy of cartographers? So I always sort of, when I think of the political aspect of cartography, I always sort of think of that line and the power they might have. But what's going on with the globe people? Because they'd be like, this is what it is.
No, but that's actually really interesting. I never thought about that. That like, at the point where you're mostly using maps, like you'd have them up on a wall in like a medieval palace, you could, in a way, a globe's even better. And it's only when you switch to printmaking that that the emphasis on two-dimensional and, that the two-dimensional emphasis becomes that much more essential. And I wonder if there's a way that, now that so much of this is consumed on the internet, you could presumably have an interactive, you don't have to show the entire world in one fixed image. You could have something where it was basically like a digital globe that you could scroll around to keep seeing what you wanted.
So Google Earth, when that sort of appeared, kind of gave this, this is great, right? Now it is a thing that we can just carry around and play with. Of course, you can't see the other side. So I imagine a Google Earth where you maybe have four spinning things, and you spin this one, and the other one turns around. So you could kind of see, if you were measuring, I don't know, some economic aspect or something, they'd kind of pop, and you'd be able to see it all at the same time. Yes, we're really stuck on the two-dimensional thing because of printing and our brains. But
right, I guess right. And at some point, it just gets so ingrained that. But I guess you bring up the issue with cartograms, and I suppose the one that first made me think about it that's been talked about the most is like U.S. electoral maps, and that the map that comes out after every election that shows the country divided up into red and blue reflects territory or physical space, not population. And so I know people have probably seen the ones where they try to do the population-weighted versions of the electoral maps, which I guess on one hand are more accurate, but also look very unsettling.
I think you're talking about the diffusion. So Mark Newman, I know this guy, I worked with him years ago, and they are, they helped in some way, but they're terrible looking things.
I know.
Right, they're absolutely awful. And because of that, I actually started to think about globes and thought, well, why don't we just have like little, things that stick out of globes? But there are also, at least for the States, they just like to have hexagons or squares, and they help. But people really use either version of those to, look at Trump, right? It's all red, like da-da-da-da. And, this happens, people bring these things up all the time, just as little, barbs to throw at people.
Right. I hadn't thought about hexagons, right? So there, it's not weighted by population or geography. It's just, but at least it's neutral. It's not overly distorted by geography.
They look cool because hexagons are cool. Yeah.
It does. I mean, to those of us outside of this, it looks mathematical, and
The bees love them. We're going to call on Ben Emery.
Yeah. Okay.
Ben Emery in Albuquerque, you're on.
Sorry, I didn't. Okay, I'll lower my hand now. Thanks for talking to us about this. I remember I saw an article that you wrote about this stuff. I think it showed up in front of me because of Twitter, where you discussed kind of all these nuances and the different hypotheses for how North ended up at the top. And then this crazy thing happened where this account created a sock puppet version of your article and changed a bunch of things. Are you recalling?
Yeah, that was so weird.
That was weird. Is that I'm just wondering, because that was odd to me, and maybe you can explain what happened in a better way than I can. But do you deal with weird reactions and backlash from the work that you do like that often, or was that a one-time?
Dude, that was really weird, and I'm used to that when I write about Turkey, because there's all sorts of, you get all kinds of crazy Turkish trolls paid by the government who attack people who write critical things about Turkey. That was my first experience with it in the U.S. domestic context. So basically it was a talk that was the article version. This is making no sense. An article that was the article version of the talk that I just gave on why North was on top. And as you heard, kind of trying to push back against this simple explanation that it was because Europeans wanted it on top. And this somehow got picked up by a kind of pro-Trump account, which retitled it as something like, North is on top because Europeans are bad, and changed my last name from Danforth to Goldman. So there was a clear anti-Semitic side to it. And you're right, I'm trying to remember what else they changed about the article, but it was a really weird, discouraging example of how it actually doesn't matter what you say and whether you try to be nuanced. People are literally going to change the words and, again, change your last name to fit the narrative they want to have of them as white Europeans being constantly under attack. So I'm glad someone else saw that. That was really bizarre.
Thank you, Ben. Ethan Davis.
Yes. Hi. My question had to do with, I know around the turn of the century, the 20th century, when they were doing trains and telegraphs, there was a really important concern with the temporal relationships that maps represented. I was wondering if these older maps had similar concerns, but maybe different ways of dealing with them.
Wait, in the sense of, I'm not sure I follow.
In the sense of maps represent where things are, but maybe also how long it takes to get there, and how.
That's interesting.
Prioritize some distances, distortions might make it seem like it would take forever to get across Greenland, right? But maybe better relative distances in Europe.
Well, I want to jump in and say, Ethan, we've had some projects on that in some of our courses. We've tried to kind of build out a whole thing for the Earth, because it's super interesting, right? Time is the best measure, really. How long does it take to get from one place to the other? And then it sort of just blows up the 2D aspect of the landscape. Very different thing. Yeah, but sorry.
No, I mean, that's really cool. So, right. Oh, sorry?
I just wanted to ask Dodge, didn't Austin Thomas do something like that in your class?
That's right.
About
there's a channel in our Slack devoted to it still. Yep.
Right, so that instead of having geographic distances fixed, instead of having a fixed correlation between the size of space on the map and its size in real life, you have the size in the map reflect the travel time. And I guess in the way that stylized subway maps have the entire subway line so that there's discrete units between each stop, which represents the experience of the subway goer and not the actual geography of where the subway stops are in the world.
Yeah, it's super interesting. There's a paper I remember coming across maybe the 30s, and it's maybe trains in Berlin, but it was trying to show that, yeah, how far away everything was in terms of time. You know, and you could imagine this over history, of course, right? So suddenly, LA comes into existence for a start, and then New York and LA are what, 5 hours apart instead of 30 days.
Yeah, you see those cool maps that have where it's like the entire world color coded according to how many days it takes to get there from London in 1900. And I guess that's like the inverse of this. It's keeping the sizes fixed on the map, but then showing, so in New York will be the same color as, somewhere in the Central Balkans, because the boat to New York actually goes pretty quickly, whereas having to travel overland to the Balkans goes much more slowly. And I suppose, right, you could imagine a map where each of those colors was turned into a concentric circle and the geography was distorted accordingly, such that everything that was in blue would be a certain distance.
But now it needs to be an interactive map where you touch something and the colors all change, right? Because it's all relative to this new center. And this has actually been done to show how you could figure out where a disease has spread from. Because if you have the count cases in cities around the world, if you start at the right city and then kind of let plane flights go out from there with a simulation, the original city for the disease, if you like, once you kind of arrange them,
cool.
All the concentric circles will look right. Like it'll look.
Huh.
Yeah. I could send that to you. It's Bruckmann and Helbing, Dirk and Dirk.
So, right, assuming the disease travels at a fixed speed and you have the concentric circle, you figure, that's cool.
Right, like it couldn't have started in Auckland, for example. Like it has to start in Chicago or something. And it's sort of this nice detective world. And you kind of, basically, you hold the thing up from the right angle and it looks fantastic. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. The one thing I'll say you do see in some of these early maps is when people were traveling by rivers, the maps would clearly be oriented so that, it's kind of like the subway lines where like the rivers would just be straight lines and they'd know they were kind of curving, but what was important was just having like the cities on the river located in the right order. Or you see maps in New England where the coastline is like that. And it's like the coastline is just a straight line and you see where Portland is, you see where Boston is, you see where New Jersey is. And for 16th century people traveling by boat, that was pretty much the essence of it.
Okay, well, Nick, this was terrific. We're going to give you a round of applause now for your awesome talk. Unmute if you feel the vibe. Thank you. It was super cool. Are we allowed to tweet screen